This is Book 1 of Sands of VenShara, written and narrated by Zaven Lashington. Chapter 1. Contentment. Fara was content. Not happy, mind you. It was difficult for anyone to be fully happy, scraping out a living in the waste of VenShara. The desert was unforgiving and unmerciful. Food was never a certainty, water a lesser one still. The dusty lands were stocked with reptilian predators. Death and tragedy was never far from her small tribe. But she was nevertheless determined to be content. She knelt by her groom's side, her husband beaming at her. The tribespeople danced around a roaring fire, asking the spirits to bless their union, to give her husband strength and her fertility. She glanced at her new husband, and gave him a polite smile, then looked up at the night sky, letting her mind fly away from the celebrations. She did not love him. She barely knew him. It was all right, though. She would be content. The marriage was good for her family. They were low-ranking amongst the tribe people. Her father had been wounded hunting years ago, and had never fully recovered. They were poor, even by the standards of her people. Fara, however, had been beautiful. She was a small woman, with a thin body that had grown accustomed to being slightly undernourished. She had a delicate face, with long dark hair, and on her face ritual tattoos made from the rare and precious green flowers turned her soft brown cheeks into a living work of art. Her skin was a rich earthly hue, and contrasting her dark skin was two piercing bright green eyes that went against the softness of her face, with how sharply her stare could cut through someone. Beautiful, yes, but like a desert rose her beauty had an edge to it. It had been enough to catch the eye of the chief. With this union, her family had now effectively become as close to nobility as one could possibly get in her small tribe. She was glad for them, and looked towards her parents sitting down by her aunts and uncles, eating better than they had in years. Her mother beamed at her, and her father looked like he was about to break down in tears. She would be content, though her thoughts wandered, and she paid little attention to the wise woman who gave a speech about fertility or something. She wasn't listening. Just went through the motions, her detached enthusiasm mistaken for piety and submissiveness by the guests. They praised her for it, traits her people considered paramount in a good wife. She didn't resent them for their views, and in truth shared much of their opinions on marriage. She accepted her place without bitterness, even thankfulness, for at least she would be married to the chief, and even if she did not love him, her life would be better than most. With those encouraging thoughts, she let her mind daydream, and her whole wedding glided past almost without her notice. That night she was moved into her new home, the house of the chief. She was adorned in rows of beautiful shell beads and the scales of fish, which to her people were no less rare and valuable than gems and rubies. For this night, and this night only, the chief's other wives bowed to her in welcome. Fara looked upon them. There was his first wife, a woman well past her youth and her fertility. She was taller than even the chief, with a thin lanky frame and wrinkles that aged her more than she was. Then there was the second wife, younger, with a plain face, but a curvy body that was somehow a bit fat. Finally there was a third wife, a woman with skin as dark as ink, and her hair as red as the setting sun. She was the definition of exotic, taken from an entirely different tribe far to the south, in a union that had created a prosperous and enduring alliance between Fara's tribe and hers. The first wife alone slightly lifted her bowed head and eyed Fara dangerously. Fara understood the gesture was a subtle reminder to remember her rank in the pecking order of wives. This might have been her night of glory, but after today she would be the youngest and least wife. Fara took it all in stride, and nodded to the other three wives, unmoved and unbothered by the first wife's subtle threat. She wasn't doing this because she loved or desired the chief. She cared nothing for family politics. Her parents would live a good life because of her union. That's all that mattered. Her husband came in after her, adorned in red clay, symbolizing his role as warrior and hunter. He devoured her with his eyes, that gleamed with passion and desire. Fara sighed inwardly, though she had to admit to herself she was curious about the pleasures of the flesh, as any virgin bride might be. He picked her up and carried her into his bedroom, tossed her on the bed like someone would toss down a sack of potatoes, and went to work. Fara, for her part, let his passion roll over her body like water, endured his moans and thrusts passively, not hating the experience, but not particularly liking it either. It was rough, somewhat painful, and short. She blinked when it was over, and glanced at him as he promptly fell off her and into his sleep, wondering if she had missed something about the pleasures of the flesh. Was that it? Oh well, she thought, she would be content. When she was sure he was fast asleep, she sat up and crept out of the bed. The village was silent, and a calm desert wind blew softly across the moonlit landscape. She was naked still, but she preferred it that way when she snuck out to the edge of her village for her nightly ritual. There were no other people around. With the vastness of the desert around her and the moon beaming down, she stretched out her hand and for the first time that day smiled, a genuine smile. The sensation came over her. It was something she could not explain. Here in the arms of the desert she felt invigorated, as if VenShara itself was filling her with life. Her soul was at peace, and all hunger and thirst fled her as if she could live off the very light of the desert moon. The wind caressed her body, and her mind fell from time and place. She forgot about everything. Even her own marriage was as distant to her mind as a dim star. Something began to crawl up her leg, and she looked down to see what most would describe as a large and most hideous black spider, almost the size of her palm. Most would have also screamed bloody murder, or froze in fear, for this was the Black Death Spider, the most venomous creature in all of VenShara. Fara was strangely calm, even happy at the sight of the thing. Bending down, she scooped this massive arachnid into her palms and brought it to her face while sitting down in the sand. "Hello, my little friend," she cooed softly. "I have been joined today to the chief, and I suppose I should be happy about it. I'll have servants, and the best food, and Mama and Papa will be honored in my tribe. It is a good day. I will be content." She gave the hairy beast a peck on its head. The spider stared back at her with expressionless eyes, but showed no indication it wanted to bite or perceived her as a threat. It accepted her affection stoically, and when she gently put it down, it stood beside her. Fara went back to her meditation, but opened her eyes again as other crawling sensations lit up her bare legs. A centipede scurried up her thigh. A moth landed on her head. 3 scorpions crawled up and sat comfortably on her breasts. Many crawling, slithering creatures approached her, as if attracted to her presence. She welcomed them all. She did not understand the nature of what was happening, why she felt compelled to come out into the desert, sometimes to dance under the stars and commune with the creatures that called her world home. She had long since given up trying to understand her nightly ritual, why she felt drawn from the time of her first bleeding to venture into the arms of the desert at night. And she dare not tell her people her strange habits. All that she knew was that it felt good, that here, with the insects about her, with the sand in her toes and the wind blowing about her hair, she felt safe, powerful even, free. Together Fara and the creature sat stoically, soaking in the view of the desert, and watched the slowly falling moon, until it almost touched the horizon. Fara sighed, not wanting to leave her spot of meditation, the joy and the freedom she felt. But it would do no good to be caught out doing whatever this was, and so she snuck back into her village and her new home before the moon had set. "Get up!" Fara lifted her head and glanced at the tall, shell-adorned figure. It was the first wife, glaring at her. Fara blinked and yawned. "Up! Up! Or do you intend to sleep the whole day away?" The first wife scoffed. Fara rolled over and sat up, feeling exhausted. It was not her late-night ritual that tired her. Quite the opposite. She felt refreshed when she returned from communing with the desert. but getting into her bed had awoken her husband, who was ready for round 2, and later round 3, and 4, and Fara enjoyed it less and less with each of his climaxes. She looked over to him, but he was gone, probably out with the other men hunting. "Get up! Get up!" Fara glanced at the first wife, trying hard to hide her annoyance. She swallowed her true feelings and got out of bed. I'm up, she said softly. "There is work to be done," the older woman barked. "Go help Miska fetch the water." Fara exited the clay-molded house that was her new home, eager to get away from the bossy woman. She was expecting it to be late in the morning, but the sun was just rising. Sleep the day away? It's not even day yet, Fara muttered to herself. With a sigh, she made her way to the well near the edge of the village. Miska, the third wife, was already at the well, a curvy, dark-skinned woman from a distant tribe to the south. She was lowering her bucket into the shoddy well that kept her people alive. She looked up at Fara's approach and smiled warmly at her. Her eyes and hair stood out from her dark skin, almost glowing like the rising sun, for they were an orange hue, completely opposite to Fara's blue-green irises. Still, Fara thought she was beautiful in her own right, and returned her smile. "Water flows to you," Fara said in greeting when she reached the well. "And from you," Miska replied. "How are you handling things, sister? I know this must be a big change for you." "I am content," Fara replied evenly, and set about helping Miska with their chores. "Have you consummated?" Miska asked casually as she lifted another bucket. "Many times," Fara replied wearily. "I'm excited for you. I wish you sons. Alas, I could only give him daughters." Is Fara's only reply. The thought of children made her uneasy, but it felt wrong to complain. Her children would be well provided for, have high ranks in her tribe, and lack nothing. She would have it easier than most. As for giving him sons, Fara would honestly rather have a daughter, though Fara had to admit that many more men had died this year. "Your daughters are beautiful. I've seen them studying with the wise woman. You gave him 3? Fara asked. "Yes, I named them all. Shikan, Piku, and Kisu," Miska said proudly. Fara chuckled. "Your people have cute names, but why no names for my people? Did our husband not suggest any?" "He said he would name one if it is a son," Miska replied evenly, but Fara caught the slight disappointment in her voice. Fara put a hand on Miska's shoulder. "You gave him 3 strong girls. There is no shame in that." Miska smiled and looked into Fara's face. "You have a kind heart. Thank you." Fara nodded, then turned her attention to the buckets of water. They had 4, and each grasped the handles of 2. Fara peered into the well one last time, her brow creased with worry. The water level had dropped again, and the life-giving liquid was so deep into the well one could no longer see or hear it. Fara could not remember the last time it rained, and it did worry her. It worried all of them. As they returned, Fara and Miska saw a crowd gathered at the village entrance. They drew close, and heard sobs coming from the crowd. They knew better than to set down their buckets and risk spilling the precious water, so as fast as they could, they walked hurriedly to the commotion. The men had returned, dragging behind them the body of a large reptilian beast. It looked like a fusion between a lizard and a pig, complete with large blood-stained tusks and a beak. Beside it was the body of a man, whose blood now painted the tusks. He was young, not much older than Fara, his eyes open, but seeing nothing. A large gash in his side still dripped with blood. Their hunt had been successful, but at a terrible price. "No!" a woman wailed, breaking from the crowd and falling on top of the dead man. "My love!" she wailed. Her family moved to comfort her. The rest of the men stood around their fallen brother, sullen and forlorn. The chief, Fara's husband, bent down and patted the weeping woman sympathetically on the back. "He did his duty," her husband said strongly. "He will be honored, and you will not go hungry." He motioned to 2 of the tribesmen, who gently but firmly pried the distraught woman off the corpse, and as softly as they could, carried her to her home. The chief nodded to the first wife, who stepped forward and started barking orders to the other woman standing there. Exhausted and with low spirits, the men slumped back to their clay homes. Hunting spears drooped. Fara and Miska moved to drag the body of the beast into the butcher house. As they came upon it, a strange sensation came over Fara. She stared into the dead beast's eyes and felt compassion and sympathy, just as powerful as what she felt for the death of her fellow tribesmen. She shook her head, trying to rid herself of the sudden and unexpected sorrow she had for a creature they regularly hunted, but she could not. Should she even try? The beast was possibly a mother or a father of its own brood. Were they not mourning its loss much like her people mourned theirs? "We will deal with the food. Prepare the body for the afterlife," the first wife commanded, snapping Fara out of her self-reflection. She grimaced. "Miska, help her with the body," the first wife said again, and Miska obeyed, though she seemed ill-suited for the task, for she was already on the verge of weeping for the dead young man. "You grab his feet," Fara instructed to Miska, while shooting the first wife a withering stare. She knew they had been assigned to this morbid task out of spite. Miska was full-on weeping by the time they carried the body into the burial hut. It was a large structure, much bigger than even the chief's home, and in it were mounds of the only thing in VenShara that was not scarce: salt. The white grains were stored high in large mounds, one side used to preserve meat, the other for preserving their dead. Many such dead lay on and in the salt now, for the past few years had been hard on her little tribe. Now another man was added to the list of losses. They placed him on top of the mound of clean salt, then worked to cover his face from head to toe, Miska weeping the whole time. "We have lost so many this season," she whimpered, and tried hard not to look at the other bodies that had already been buried. Fara did look. She did not weep at the sight of them. Her sadness was more subtle, a dull ache in her heart, but one that understood the reality of their lives. She accepted their lot in life stoically and with wisdom beyond her years. Men died in battles, or on hunts. Women died in childbirth. Everyone died from illness, and there was nothing the tribe could do but try and push on and replace their losses. They would survive. They always survived. For thousands of years they survived. Still, it had been a hard year. "It will get better when the rains come," Fara reassured her. "If they come," Miska sighed. "They will eventually. Then our men can fish for our food, instead of risking hunting the desert beasts. And we can search wide and far for fruits and berries instead of being tied to a dying well. They will come eventually. They always come. And when they do, the first wife might lay off a bit." Miska chuckled through her tears. "Don't take it personally. She bullied me the same way when I was the youngest wife. We threaten her, and she must dominate us to make herself feel better." "How do we threaten her? She is the first wife. She outranks us," Fara asked, pouring salt over the face of the deceased. "She has lost her youth, and I think she envies our own," Miska replied. Our husband does not touch her bed. I think she is jealous of the attention he gives us, specifically you." "Well, she isn't missing much," Fara huffed, which drew a laugh from Miska. "Does he not satisfy you?" "Is he supposed to?" Fara asked. Miska looked up at Fara wide-eyed, and though there were still tears in her eyes, Fara's question did draw an amused laugh. "Yes, but you must guide him. Men are but dumb beasts when it comes to making love. If you just lie there, they'll thrash around on top of you and be done with it. You must guide them, train them to satisfy you. I could show you how." Fara lifted a hand. "No thanks. That sounds like too much effort. I don't need satisfaction. He can thrash around on me all he wants, as long as he makes it quick so I can get about my day. That is something he does well, though." "You do not desire our husband?" Miska asked honestly. No, I did not. What do you desire, Fara? Miska asked more tenderly now. Fara paused, somewhat taken back by the question. What did she desire? What in her heart of hearts did she want, if not to be the chief's wife? I only wanted my parents to be well, and they are now, thanks to this marriage. Miska shook her head. And now that you've gotten your wish, what do you want now? Fara thought again. Rain? Food? For our people to not always be on the verge of hunger? For us to never again take a body into a burial house and cover their faces with salt? To walk across a green VenShara? And if you had all that? Miska asked again. Then I suppose I want nothing, Fara replied, though in truth it was an answer given out of ignorance, for she had never truly considered the question. What did she want? If all her basic needs were met, what dreams did she have beyond not dying? It is pointless to consider such things. It does not matter what I want. The world does not give women like us the option of choosing anyway. We must be content with the little good we have in our lives. My parents will be taken care of. I will be the chief's wife. I will have servants and food, and my children will grow fat and strong. I will be content with that. Miska looked at her curiously, then smiled. You are wise for your age. It is a good answer. What do you want? Fara asked curiously. To go home. I love our husband, but I did not want to leave my homeland. I miss it. I miss my people, our language, our dances. But it is as you say. I will be content with what I have. Could you not visit? Fara asked. Miska smiled sadly. Even if I knew the way, I would be dead before I reached it. And the treaty between our peoples might be broken. Remember, my marriage to your husband was done as a peace offering between our tribes. Fara nodded in understanding. Your sacrifice keeps us safe. I thank you, Miska. They finished burying him and left the burial house silently. Fara's heart was moved by Miska's simple desire. It was true that as an outsider, even the chief's wife, she never fully fit in. Miska. Yes? She said, turning around. I cannot give you back your people, but if you will have me, I would like to be one of your people. I could learn your language, and we could talk privately about our wildest desires. Miska positively beamed, and she wrapped Fara in a hug and a squeeze. I would like that, sister. They let go of each other, and Fara walked away with a smile. It was a rare thing for her to make a friend. That night, after her husband had fallen asleep, she snuck out to do her nightly ritual. Ever since she was a child, she was drawn to the desert, as if VenShara was calling to her. Once, when she was 3, she wandered into the desert and was lost for a week. The whole village thought she was dead, until one day she returned unharmed and none the worse. She vaguely remembered her now husband at the time being a young man back then. Freedom, she thought to herself, as she sat on the dune overlooking the wide, vast oceans of sand. She could not be free in body, but in spirit. She closed her eyes and let the desert fill her with life. Her mind fell away again, and all concerns in the world dissolved. The wind blew and caressed her hair, and she felt as if her spirit was lifted from her body and flew free. It was at that moment she sensed something. Another life form, close, very close. She put her hand to her belly and furrowed her brow. Inside her? She opened her eyes and looked down at her belly. Somehow she knew, she just knew. She was pregnant. Her emotion was half excitement, half dread. Did she even want to be a mother? She had never given it much thought. There had been no point. She would be a mother. Her tribe demanded it. It demanded it of all women, as it demanded men to strike out and die hunting and fighting. But now, faced with the hypothetical made real, Fara was unsure if she liked this path she was on. It didn't matter. There was no other path for her to consider. I will be content, she said in resignation, then looked out at the night sky determined. I will be content. Chapter 2. VenShara. Time dragged on, 3 days to 3 weeks, and 3 weeks to 3 months. Life for her people carried on unchanging. Fara would wake up and get busy with the endless task of fighting back the ever-marching tendrils of entropy. She cooked, cleaned, and worked as faithfully and as diligently as any wife could. Her husband doted on her, considered her the apple of his eye. It was clear that she was his favorite wife. Fara wasn't sure why. She hardly spoke to him, unless he spoke to her first, and never said much. Then again, maybe that was a plus in the man's eyes. For the first and second wife were the opposite, constantly demanding his attention when he returned from the hunt to do this or do that. To be fair, Fara didn't speak much to anyone, aside from Miska and her parents when they occasionally visited. When not doing chores, she stayed in her room, or took walks into the desert and kept to herself. Loneliness was her friend, and she shied from social interactions with most people to the point that one of her husband's friends inquired if Fara was mute. She was not mute. She just had little reason or desire for idle chatter. Soon signs of the child growing in her were visible, and her husband, upon noticing, put a hand to her belly and kissed her on the forehead gently. She blushed, feeling for the first time a tinge of affection for the man. "Make me a son, Fara, and you will truly be the greatest of wives," he said, petting her belly. And like that, the affection was gone. She frowned at him and said curtly, "Why would a daughter make me any less great?" "I have enough daughters. We need men," he replied matter-of-factly. Fara didn't push the matter. She looked back at the cooking still needing to be done. "I need to get to work," she said, not looking at him. "Yes, you are an ever-diligent wife. That's what I love about you." She rolled her eyes at him inwardly, as not to offend him. "I will be content," she sighed, putting the mildly upsetting conversation behind her. The one good thing about her pregnancy was that she was less bothered by her passionate husband at night. Soon she had whole nights to herself. She would with some frequency claim to be exhausted from the day's work and turn in early, only to sneak out when all the fires had died down, to dance in the desert and free her spirit. She rubbed her growing belly, sitting down on the sand, her friend the wind caressing her face and seeming to touch her womb. "Be a girl," Fara whispered to her belly, "just to spite him." She giggled to herself, not really meaning what she said, but still laughing at the thought of giving him another daughter. Between Miska and the second wife, he already had 6. "If you're a girl, I will name you Shara. It means desert. It is a good name, for I love the desert. If you are a boy, I'm not sure what I'll name you, but you will be loved just as much, I promise." She spoke to her baby as she walked towards the village, sneaking into her home through the window, when suddenly she heard commotion. People's feet shuffled outside, and calls of "Get the wise woman!" rang out. Fara poked her head out in time to see 2 men carrying a woman who was sweating profusely. Fara gasped as she recognized the second wife, carried away into the clay home of the wise woman. She suddenly became ill, Miska said, approaching her from behind. "What happened?" Fara asked. She stopped speaking right, couldn't move one of her arms correctly, then collapsed. "I hope she's okay." "We will pray to the spirits," Fara said. Miska nodded, and both prayed to the spirits of their ancestors and of the desert for healing. But if the spirits existed, they were not listening, for by the next morning the second wife was dead. Fara and Miska were spared from carrying her into the burial house. Her husband did that honor, and oh, how he wept. Fara had never seen her husband as broken as he was that day. She watched him carry her into the burial house with a procession of mourners. Though she did not love him, her heart still broke for him, for the second wife had been with him for many years. "It has been a hard year indeed," Fara said, looking at the downcast faces of her tribe. Her hand instinctively moved to her belly, and she rubbed the new life that was growing. What kind of world was she bringing her child into? Where death stalked and pounced at seemingly random times without cause? Where suffering was their constant companion? Perhaps it would be better if the child was returned to the spirit world now, and came back when the rains come, and life was easier. But what was she to do? She could not return the coming babe and wait for better times. Thoughts of leaving her village and finding a safer place for her child briefly crossed her mind, but she dismissed them. Leaving while pregnant was suicide. Leaving at all was suicide. "When you come, you must learn to be content with what you have. That will be my first lesson to you," she whispered to her baby, then looked sadly at the procession heading into the burial house. It took a few days for the salt to completely dry out a body. When the process was finished, the tribe gathered together. Men and women danced to please the spirits and encouraged them to take the soul of the departed back to the realm beyond. Then the wise woman, with the help of the departed's family, lowered the mummified remains deep into the sand, deep enough so the wind would not disturb them and predators would not gnaw on the flesh. Not that there would be much to gnaw on. The salt dried out the body so effectively the remaining flesh was hard as rock. Today they buried 3 of their tribe of 50. A young babe, the second wife, and a hunter who had died the week before. Fara looked at the mother of the babe, a gentlewoman about 40, on her knees and sobbing. She had been reluctant to bury the body, and the chief out of pity had allowed her to visit the mummified remains of her infant long past the time it should have been buried. His hand had forced it now, and the devastated mother sank to her knees, wailing in agony. Fara looked away, a new fear unlocked for her own coming babe, and she prayed aloud that her child would be born healthy. After the ceremony, the tribe went back to the daily struggle to survive. There were no allotted days of mourning. They had no time for that. The men went back to hunting, the women back to maintaining the village, each person battling back the relentless march of death in their own way. Fara's belly swelled, and her workload decreased. She still worked diligently, but was no longer required to walk the half a mile needed to fetch water, or to carry the departed into the burial house. With the extra free time, she spent it talking to Miska, who happily shared her insights on motherhood. When not speaking to Miska, or visiting her parent, she was out in the desert. Whatever connection she had to the land had only grown stronger. She walked freely across the dunes, letting the creatures of the desert crawl on her, or sit in her hair and rest in her palm. Fara once again pondered her connection to VenShara. Was she magic? She had heard of people in distant lands who had powerful abilities they used to wage war. Till recently, she always assumed her affinity for the desert was just an odd quirk. But as the white spider crawled into her palm, joined by a writhing centipede that skittered on her arm, she began to suspect that this was something more. She often considered telling the wise woman of the village what was happening to her, for it was said that the wise woman also had magic. Perhaps the old woman could give her some insights. But Fara feared what her people might do to her if they ever found out about her strangeness. Would they understand? How could they? She didn't even understand it. She resolved to keep it to herself, her one joy in life, the one thing that gave her peace. She would not jeopardize it for anything. She smiled as she considered what her life would look like from now. In the day she would work and be a dutiful wife. She would have many children, and at night she would come here and let her spirit be free. It was not ideal, but it was good enough. She could be happy. If not happy, she could be content, as long as she had this quiet place to dance amongst the stars. This day had been a good one, so late into her development that not even the first wife had dared commanded her to labor. She had asked her husband and Miska to leave to sleep, and as the sun had set, she had snuck out and slinked into the welcoming arms of the desert. The moon was full again, and she had let her spirit run free for many glorious hours, but the dawn approached, and she had to get back to her home before someone realized she was gone. As she rose to leave, something she could not understand told her to stay. It was not a voice, but a feeling, as if the desert itself was imposing its desires on her. She stopped and turned, her breathing quickening. Power and energy flowed through her. Wind twirled about her, and then the first contraction. She panicked, suddenly realizing that her baby could be coming now. She had to get back and find the wet nurses and the wise woman. She turned to leave again, but stopped, a sudden calm washing over her. No, she would stay. She should stay. She sat down. Power she could not begin to comprehend grew within her. Wind spun, whipping up sand that blocked her from view, as if the desert were protecting her during her vulnerable state. Swarms of white lunar moths fluttered about her, as if excited, like they knew what was about to happen. Every kind of creeping creature rose from the sand and crawled in a large organized circle around her. Fara didn't know what was happening. Was she doing this? Was it the spirits? She should be scared, but she felt calm. Then instincts guided her. Fara lay down, a miraculous peace flowing over her, and then, with legs parted, she cried out, and the magic, or spirits, or energy, or whatever the force was that had been with her since she was small, whirled even greater. Fara was barely able to remember what happened next. Pain, unlike anything she could remember, rocked her body, but she did not panic. She labored and pushed and cried out, but never once did she worry or fear. The desert was with her. She knew it. Fara didn't know how long she had laid there, battling one of womanhood's greatest challenges. All she knew was that when the winds died away, another cry replaced hers. Panting, she looked down to see a screaming baby boy still covered in her body fluids. Fara stared at him in shock for a moment. Then her motherly instincts kicked in and she scooped him up into her arms. Grabbing a small stone knife she kept on her, she cut his cord and put him to her breast, amazed by what happened. She looked about. The desert had returned to normal, as if nothing happened. The creature scurried away, save for the moths that alighted onto her and her baby boy. Instead of feeling exhausted, as any woman should, she felt energized, as if she could run all through VenShara without hardly taking a breath. A sudden grunt escaped her mouth, and she pushed instinctively. The rest of what was inside her was evicted by her almost supernaturally vigorous body. She had seen birthing before. It shouldn't have been this fast or this effortless. It was like something greater, much greater than herself, had helped her. She looked down at her now quiet child, peacefully sucking away, and her confusion gave way to genuine and true happiness. At that moment, she knew what she would call him. You will be named VenShara. It means gift of the desert, for truly the desert has delivered you to me more than any man or midwife. I am... no, not content. That's not the word. I am happy. She beamed at him, suddenly realizing this new sensation for what it was. For the first time in her life, she was happy. The first rays of the sun startled her, and with a panic she sprung to her feet. She had to get back. But how to explain the sudden birth of her baby? She just had him in her room? And no one heard her? She shook her head. She would figure it out on the way. Hurriedly, she rushed back to her village, dreading that the sudden storm of power had woken them up somehow. Hopefully her people thought it was just an early morning sandstorm. Luck is on her side. She sneaked in through the window just as her family was beginning to stir, and lay down beside her baby. She was left to sleep in, and she did sleep soundly with her newborn. She woke up some hours later, to the tap on the wall that separated her room from the other wives. "Fara?" Miska asked. "Miska, come in, and be quiet. I have something to show you," Fara whispered from behind her wall of shells. Miska hurried to Fara's room entrance, walking through the beads that served as a door for the clay room. She entered with a bowl of food, and promptly dropped it. Her jaw fell even faster than the food. "Is that?" she stammered. "Yes," Fara said, rocking her baby in her arms. "When? How? Shh!" Fara hissed. "No one knows yet." Miska blinked, rubbed her eyes, then blinked again. She looked around the room. Where's the blood? The afterbirth? You were as big as a wally fruit yesterday." Fara bit her lip, trying to think of a believable lie. "I went for a walk last night, and he just came. I couldn't get back in time, honestly. It wasn't that difficult. I just pushed, and he popped out." Miska sat with her eyes wide. "Fara, that's amazing! If I didn't know better, I'd say you stole a baby, but your belly is gone, and you're fine. You look better than before you were pregnant. How?" Fara shrugged. "What I said is the truth, though I don't know if anyone else will believe me." "What's not to believe?" Miska laughed. "You're the only woman to give birth this week, and your belly is gone. Unless a Dejin has replaced you with a double, everyone will have to accept it." For a moment, Miska eyed Fara suspiciously. Fara laughed. "I assure you, I am the real Fara." "Then you have nothing to fear. Let's tell the wise woman. Oh, and it's a son. Our husband will be eager to name him." Fara's jovial attitude stopped abruptly, her smile collapsing into a frown. "I have already named him." "Oh?" "His name is Kishara." Miska tapped her chin. "Isn't that a feminine name?" "I don't care what you think it is. That is his name," Fara said, determined. Okay. I'm not sure how her husband will take it, though. Usually the men like to name the boys," Miska said with some concern. "I'll give him a daughter, and he can name that one to make up for it," Fara huffed. "Well, we should see the wise woman, anyway. Stay here." Miska ran out, and Fara sat on the bed, still rocking her baby. She was determined in her cause. For this she would not back down. Word spread quickly, and soon the wise woman was shuffling along with much of her tribe to her home. Fara waited at the entrance of the chief's house, with her baby asleep in her arms, as the crowds of people approached her. The wise woman stopped, wide-eyed at the child, and at how quickly Fara's body had recovered. "When? How?" the old woman asked. "I told you she went for a walk," Miska answered. The wise woman spun to the two men who was supposed to be guarding last night. "Did you see anything?" Both of them shrugged. "And no one heard?" the wise woman asked again, amazed. "Impossible!" It was the first wife. She stepped out from the crowd and looked accusingly at Fara. "The work of evil spirits!" "What kind of evil spirit would help a woman give birth?" "Look at me," Fara said, gesturing to her now slim body. "Look at my baby," she added, raising her child, who looked strong and healthy. "Let me see it." The wise woman came forward, hands outstretched. Fara was reluctant at first, but slowly she handed her bundle to the old woman. The wise woman looked at her child, studied its face, and as she was contemplating, the chief, Fara's husband, ran into the crowd. "Is it true? The child is born?" he demanded. The crowd looked towards the wise woman. "It is," Fara said, and her husband stared at her in amazement. "How? When?" he stammered, and Fara realized she would have to answer that question many more times. "I was taking a nighttime stroll to get some air and—" "Lies!" The first wife pointed an accusing finger. "Don't think I don't know where you go, you little witch. You meet with dark spirits under the full moon. I have seen it once. Fara was stunned by the accusation. The first wife knew? For how long? Her people stared at her with sudden suspicion. I do not, Fara stammered, but the first wife cut her off. Throw the thing into the well. Let the water carry it away. It is of dark magic. Fara nearly fainted, but rage and desperation overwhelmed her. No, do not harm my son. Your son is a dark spirit, and— Enough! The chief's booming voice silenced both of them. He turned to the wise woman. It is a son? The wise woman looked up at him and smiled. It is your son, healthy, strong. Look how he grips my finger. We will have a mighty man. But how did she deliver him without maids? Without making a sound? The first wife spat, glaring at Fara, who for the first time glared back at her. The wise woman looked at Fara, as did they all. Fara swallowed, realizing that the wise woman's verdict would seal her fate and the fate of her child. The old woman lifted a bony finger to Fara and then clapped. On your wedding night we danced and asked the spirits to bless you with fertility. Is this not the answer to our prayers? Look, she has delivered you, chief, a son, and already looks fit to breed again. Her womb is strong, such vigor, such vitality. The spirits are with her. The whole tribe cheered, save for the first wife, who scowled at Fara and slinked away. Fara breathed a sigh of relief and rushed to the wise woman to take her son, but her husband got there first and scooped up the now crying child into his arms and lifted him up. My most favored wife, you have given me a son after many daughters. I shall name him, he declares to the hoops of the tribe's people. He already has a name, Fara shouted, grabbing him from her husband, her voice stern and forceful. The chief regarded the little woman curiously. Never had he or any of them heard Fara raise her voice. Some had never even heard her speak in all the years she was in the tribe. But now, in front of the whole tribe, she defied him. His name is VenShara, for the desert gave him to me, she declared. That is a weak name, the chief said. He needs a warrior's name, like Slay Khan. His name is VenShara. Fara held him tighter and stomped her foot. I am the one who carried him for 9 months. I am the one who brought him into this world, alone, with no help from any of you. I am the one blessed with the spirits. I named him. You can name the next one. You can name every child I give you, but this one's name is VenShara. The chief studied her a moment. He crossed his arms, and Fara kept her expression polite, but unyielding. Her husband looked at the wise woman, who only shrugged. He relented. Very well. Only because you are my favored wife, and because the spirits have chosen you. But I will hold you to your words, Fara. Fara nodded, relaxing somewhat. Favored wife or no, standing up to the chief had been nerve-wracking. He approached her, and gently lifted the child from her hands, raising it high for the gathered tribe to see. The world welcomes my son. His name shall be VenShara, gift of the desert, he proclaimed, and the whole tribe shouted his name. Welcome, VenShara, her people cried in unison, and rushed to welcome the new life, the tension forgotten. Fara smiled to see the joy in her people. Just as they danced to send spirits off to the afterlife, they danced to welcome new ones. Tambourines and ulations greeted her son, who showed the strength of his lungs with a strong cry. Fara glanced to see where the first wife had gone. She had never liked the bossy woman, but now that mild dislike had turned to active hatred and fear. The first wife knew. What else did she know? How much of her nightly ritual had she seen? Could she afford to go out to never do it again? Fara pondered her situation, determining that as long as the chief favored her, there was little the first wife could do to her. She had given him a son after many daughters, and had even got away with defying him. But how long would his favor last? When he eventually found a younger, prettier wife, then what? "I will be content," she said to herself, and her little motto calmed her rising anxiety. As long as she had VenShara, she could be content, even if she fell out of favor with her husband, or was eventually replaced with a younger wife. As long as she had her son, that was all that mattered. Fara did not return to the desert for many months. She wanted to, and the inability to commune with the winds and the sand and the creeping things felt like it was making a hole in her heart. She clung tight to her boy, who grew rapidly, learning to crawl, even stand weeks before others of the same age could. No one spoke against her, not even the first wife, though she continued to order Fara around. Fara held her tongue around the wicked woman, and did as she was told, making sure to always look over her shoulder as she went about her duties. She felt like she was being watched, as if the first wife's words had left an impact on the minds of her tribespeople. They treated her with respect due her status, but Fara always felt they had become more weary of her. It didn't help that for her part, she was almost a recluse. Fara spoke little to anyone that was not Miskva, asked little and demanded nothing. She did not partake in the gossip that served as entertainment for the other women in the village, a veritable sacred tradition as far as they were concerned, and she always got the sense that their gossip was focused on her. She didn't mind. Let them gossip about her if it made their days more bearable. She did not hold it against them, for in her heart she knew they were correct about her. She was strange. She had always been strange even when she was a little girl, antisocial and uncomfortable around people. To Fara, solitude was a friend, a fortress of peace and safety, and above all else save the happiness of her child, she desired to be left alone. Only a select few people were allowed into that fortress. Her husband, out of obligation, her parents out of duty, and Miskva. Her only friend. Miskva and Fara had grown close, united by their shared sense of isolation. But even in this, Miskva had to adapt herself to Fara's unique type of friendship. Even to her, Fara did not say much, but showed her affection and appreciation for Miskva through her actions. She was the only person Fara felt comfortable leaving her son alone with, and she always returned with little gifts for Miskva. Beautiful desert flowers, rare and impossible to find for anyone except Fara. Shell necklaces, their versions of jewelry, and hugs. Fara and Miskva often settled in a tender embrace, silently and contently watching their children play together, taking comfort from each other's presence. Their friendship was quiet and simple, but no less powerful for it. One day Fara returned late that evening after completing another hard day's work. The sun was setting, and her tribe people went about their evening duties, whispering worriedly. It still had not rained. Fara had been coming from the well, though the water in it was every day becoming more like mud. She had to waste precious time scooping up mud into her water bucket, and then into a towel, and then squeezing the precious liquid into another water bucket. Visits to the well now took twice as long to complete for half the water. Showering or bathing had been prohibited, and the whole tribe smelled mildly of sweat and toil, but there was little they could do. They could not afford to waste drinking water for baths. Upon returning to the chief's home, Fara heard Miskva weeping inside her room. Almost dropping her water buckets, Fara hastily ran inside. "My sister, what troubles you?" she asked, coming to Miskva's side. Her dear friend was sitting on her bed. VenShara and her 3 children were already put to bed, and she sat alone, weeping softly. Miskva looked up, her tears streaming down her cheeks. "I am a terrible friend," Miskva whimpered. "What are you speaking of?" Fara put a hand on hers. "I am angry with you, without cause." "If I have wronged you, tell me." "Why does he love you so much?" Miska said, suddenly angry. Who? Fara asked, not understanding. You do not even think of him. Oh, my sister, you are truly blameless. Our husband. Why does our husband love you so? Fara looked at Miska's sorrowful eyes and could see her frustration. Her heart broke for her friend, and she looked down, feeling guilty. Fara knew it was not her fault. She could not have been more indifferent to her husband if she tried. She was not cold with him, but the kindness she showed to the man was done out of politeness, not love. Despite that, their husband had been doting on her, visiting her room many nights, and showering her with all his affection and love, if one could call it that. If Fara could make him give all his affections to Miska, and leave none for her, in that moment she would have. I don't know, Fara said quietly. It is because you are beautiful. I am scrawny, Fara countered. You are full and bountiful. I am like a child compared to you. He does not see it that way. He ignores me. It's like I don't even exist. I have to beg him to touch me, and he does so reluctantly. Ever since you came, it's like I'm less than the sand under his feet. It's not your fault. You've been good to me, but I can't help how I feel. Miska buried her face in her hands. I envy you. I hate you. You, my only friend, my best friend, and I hate you. Fara knelt beside her, wrapped Miska in a gentle embrace, and squeezed her. We cannot control who our husband gives his love to, but we can control who our love goes to. I do not care if you hate me. In fact, I welcome it, all your hate or affection, but whatever you give me, I choose to give you love. You have been good to me in VenShara. My days are bearable because I have you as my only friend. And if I could give you all the affection of our husband, or the whole world, I would. But the gods do not give such choices to women like us. We must be content with what we have, no matter how unfair. Know this, Miska, I'm not angry with you. I weep with you. I wish he could love you the way I love you, the way I always love you. Miska wiped her eyes and sniffed. You love me, even after all I've said. With all my heart and soul, is Fara's gentle reply, and she meant every word. Miska looked up into Fara's blue-green eyes, so opposite from her own, eyes like the sea that flowed with strength. She kissed her. It was a short and tender kiss, and when their lips parted, they looked away somewhat shocked and embarrassed at what had just happened. Fara tried to sort through the jumble of feelings that had caused the unexpected display of affection. Her heart fluttered in one moment, and was thrown aside by embarrassment the next. Should she apologize? Well, she didn't initiate the kiss. Miska had, but she didn't resist either. Was this adultery? Does cheating on your husband with his wife, while also being his wife, count as adultery? Was this love? Or were they just two affection-starved people who, in their desperation, sought love from the only source that would give it, each other? Sorry, Miska said, standing suddenly. Are you all right? Fara asked her, putting aside her confused feelings for the sake of comforting her friend. I'm fine. I'm sorry I sprung this on you suddenly. I'm just confused. Miska shook her head, not looking at Fara. Have a good night. She left the room. Fara sat still, touching her lips. She slid onto her bed and put a gentle hand on VenShara, who slept beside her in a small crib. She wasn't sure what had just happened, but she was somewhat relieved it had happened. If anything, it meant that whatever hatred Miska had for her couldn't have been that deep. She rolled over and smiled lightly at the thought. She would be content with that. Chapter 3. The Limits of Contentment. It still had not rained. VenShara was almost 2, and waddled about Fara, cooing and babbling, oblivious to the crisis now facing her tribe. They were nomadic by nature, only stopping near select locations during the dry season, where underground rivers could sustain them until the rains came. Long had it been since the rains had last come, so long Fara suspected she was many years older than the 10 rainy seasons she referred to herself as. Now the tribe was in a subtle, quiet panic. The well had all but dried. They drank more mud than water, and still not a cloud could be seen. Everywhere Fara went, she heard people quietly debating the wisdom of leaving their only well for 400 miles in hope that they could randomly find another water source. The lack of water had also affected the hunters of the village. They caught little now, their herds of reptilian beasts having deserted the doomed land. All were hungry, yet the work they needed only increased. Fara had not been into the desert for some time now, and she missed her nightly ritual desperately. But she would not risk incriminating herself with the first wife or anybody, not with VenShara still in such a vulnerable state. She was at the well, squeezing what little water remained in the drying mud into buckets, but it honestly felt like she was sweating more water than she was wringing out from the damp mud. She felt in her heart that something was not right with the land, but it was too distant and vague a feeling to do anything with. VenShara was strapped to her back, happily playing with the mud, squeezing it through his hands and wiping it in her hair. She smiled at his merriment, but was genuinely beginning to fear for his and all their futures. She walked back with what little water she got from the well, but as she approached her village, her eye caught a silver glimmer coming from over the horizon. She paused, trying to make out the flashes of silver. After a moment, her eyes opened wide, and panic rose within her. The silver were the flashing tips of metal spears held by an army heading towards her village. She truly did drop the buckets of water, spilling the hard-earned liquid into the greedy sand, which instantly swallowed it. It didn't matter. She might have been the first person to see the army, and she ran to warn her people. If they meant to attack her tribe, they still had time to pack up and flee. She sprinted down the dusty path, and was soon upon the village, waving her hand. "Soldiers! Coming from my rear!" she shouted, and the men guarding the gate of her village immediately jumped into action as soon as they could make out her frantic warning. Like clockwork, each villager began to pack up what little they could carry in case they had to run. Fara ran into her village, heading towards her own clay house. She ran into her husband, and he stops her by putting a gentle hand on her shoulders with a look of concern. "How many?" he asked. "Many, many 10s, and they have metal weapons and armor. If they mean to attack, our warriors will not prevail," she said, trying to be helpful. Her husband nodded and kissed her on the forehead. "You did well to run back so quickly, favored wife. We shall send a scout to see what they want. Gather your things in case we must flee." Fara nodded, though inwardly she resented being called favored wife. She wished dearly that Miska could be honored with that title instead of her. Miska and Fara had grown distant since that night they shared a kiss. "I will warn your other wives," Fara said, emphasizing the word other. She pulled from him and ran into their house. She passed the first wife's chambers, hoping deep down that she would not learn of the commotion and be killed in the coming battle if there was one. She opened Miska's door and found her friend already packing, her children huddled about her in fear and confusion. "What's happened?" Miska asked. "An army approaches. We are getting ready to flee if it turns to battle," Fara replied. "I guessed as much. That's the last thing we need. Will the spirits not help us?" Miska said despondently. "Come, let us make for the rear of the village. It will give us a head start if we have to run," Fara offered her hand. "If we have to run, we'll be good as dead anyway," Miska replied darkly, not taking Fara's hand. They both exited their home and began to make their way with the other women and children to the rear of the village. Her tribesmen stood at the entrance, stone-tipped spears raised. Fara looked back to see her husband standing at the front of his men, his own spear in his hand, his eyes focused, determined. Soon enough, the procession of spears cleared the horizon, and the whole tribe could see the marching army coming towards them. They looked like gods. Men marched in gold and white armor, with long silver-tipped spears in one hand, their other hand on the hilts of their swords. In front of them a tall man rode, to Fara's amazement, one of the desert beasts her tribe used to hunt. The reptilian creature was large and powerful, though in truth there was something mammalian about them, as if they were a fusion of the two clades of creatures. Tusks like a boar stuck out from the reptile's face. The man who rode it wore a helmet that was fashioned into the shape of a fish, a truly rare and sacred creature to her desert-stranded people. Blue banners, emblazoned with the pictures of fish and other ocean-going monsters, were waved high above them, though Fara had never seen the ocean and did not know what they were. More intriguing to her, however, were the women. They marched alongside the men, seemingly as equals, though their armor was far lighter, and in their hands they carried staves and wands instead of swords. Fara sensed something in them, even from that great distance, something akin to what she often felt in the desert, but she wasn't sure what it was. The army numbered only a few hundred, but it was still many times greater than her small tribe. Slowly they approached her people's mud huts, and stopped before her husband. Fara couldn't help herself. She left the crowd of women and children at the back of the village, and began to sneak closer to hear what they were talking about. "Fara!" Miska hissed. "Stay where you are! Where are you going?" "I just want to hear," Fara said, stalking closer as her husband was approached by the man on top of the giant beast. Fara stopped short of the line of male warriors. They would have barked at her to go back to the village, but they were too focused on the possible doom in front of them to notice her presence. Miska was only a little ways behind her, hiding around the corner of a mud hut. Her husband and the general spoke for some time, and Fara got the sense they were not here to attack. Still, the chief walked back to his line of men looking very nervous. The man on the beast trotted up to the line of raised spears, and Fara could see that his skin, and the skin of most of the strange soldiers that were here, were lighter than her own. Their eyes did not share the shades of green that were common to her people, but were a brown, rusty color. The general then said in a booming voice that the whole village could hear, "In the name of Dagon, god of VenShara and the flowing water of life, and in the name of your king, Bahamaman III, I bid all subjects listen to the king's orders," he shouted. Her entire tribe looked at him blankly, and he huffed, somewhat caught off guard by their blank and confused stares. A woman walked up behind him and said helpfully, "They do not understand the word king. They refer to their leaders as chiefs." The general cleared his throat. "Your chief has given you orders that you now must hear." The entire tribe looked at her husband expectantly, and he looked around, helpless, and shrugged. "Not him, you uncivilized brutes! Your king, chief!" The general roared in frustration, but her people did not have a word for civilized, and though they spoke the same language, it was clear that the two groups shared a common tongue a very long time ago. As such, it was hard for Fara to translate what he was saying, especially when the flustered shiny man was angry. His tone frightened her people, however, and her tribesmen lowered their spears, expecting an attack. Her husband raised a hand, calming them, then turned to face his people and shouted, "There is a big chief bigger than me. He wants us to do something for him." Her tribe understood now and hesitantly came forward, crowding around the entrance of the village. "I swear, why do we even bother with these backwards? Dagon, give me strength!" The shiny man cursed, and the woman beside him chuckled. "Just read the order. I can translate for them. I studied the savage tongue for many years back at the academy." "Very well," he said, opening a scroll. There were several words Fara heard, but did not understand, and the more she studied these strange people, the more enthralled she became. These were people from beyond her little world. They might as well have been aliens to her. The shiny man cleared his throat again and began to proclaim their bigger chief's command. "All citizens of Pia and her territories, colonies, provinces, and municipalities, etc., etc., shall be counted in a census for the king's consideration. You are commanded to sign a document, state your first and last name, income, profession, age, gender, and religious affiliation at one of Pia's garrisons. If you are not living in one of Pia's cities, towns, camps, municipalities, etc., and thus are not near one of Pia's garrisons, then a census force shall be dispatched post-haste to your location, and you are required, by law, to comply with their orders or face legal punishment that is included, but not limited to, the freezing of assets, arrest, torture, execution, etc. He closed the scroll, and almost nothing he said was understood by her or her people. The foreign woman stood out in front. Her skin, like the shiny man, was lighter relative to Fara, and her eyes were a deep blue. Even more strange to Fara was her blonde hair, a feature Fara had never seen before. She proclaimed in a tongue they better understood. "Biggest chief in the world is counting everyone who lives in his tribe, and that includes you. Tell me who you are, and what you do, and if you can write, put it here." She snapped her fingers, and 2 soldiers carried out a table with paper and ink. Save for the table, Fara did not recognize any of the objects placed out in front of them. She stared in wonder as her husband started giving orders, organizing her tribe into a straight line. The next few hours were an exercise in frustration for the general and the woman. First and last name, gender, occupation, religious affiliation, and signature. Simple enough requests. Save her people had almost none of these, or a very different understanding of what these things were. And forget about writing forms. Most of her tribe had never even seen a pen. "What is your first name?" the woman asked a warrior who said proudly, "Mahoshan." "What's your last name?" He blinked, not understanding. "Last name," she said again. "Mahoshan?" He replied, thinking she was asking the same question. She sighed and wrote down, Mahoshan in his file. "And what is your profession?" "What?" Poor Mahoshan tilted his head. "What do you do during the day?" she asked, trying to be patient. He blinked, and furrowed his brow like she had just asked the stupidest question in the world. "Eat, hunt, shit. What everybody else does in the day," he answered honestly, then laughed with his friend standing behind him. "Hunter-tracker," she wrote down for him, not dignifying his answer with a response. "Can you sign this You know what?" The woman saved herself the trouble and poured some ink from her pot onto a piece of paper, then said, "Put your finger in the ink, then tap your finger on the document or paper." "What is paper?" he asked. "This thing." She pointed to his legal document, rubbing her temple. "Ah." He does as he's told, but dabbed his finger right where she had written his information. "No, not there!" she cried, and he stood up startled by her outburst. "You said on the paper." "You see that little blank square?" She pointed to the small blank square on the paper where he should have normally written his signature. But Fara's people didn't have writing, and so the scribbles she had made on his document meant nothing to him, and he did not understand the difference it made if he put his finger on the blank square or on the scribble. "Next!" shouted the woman, seeing as he was genuinely clueless and giving up on explaining it. The general had an even worse time. He could not speak their dialect as well, and kept flipping the table and the ink in a rage, which sent the people he was trying to get information out of scurrying. The foreigners went through what must have been gallons of ink that day, replacing the little pots every time the general flipped his table. Eventually it was Fara's turn. The line was almost complete, and the woman, along with her general, looked as if their patience had long ran out. "Name?" "Fara," Fara said, sitting down. Fara, the woman wrote down. Fara looked at the document curiously. She could not read or write, but understood that the scribbles on the paper meant something. She had also deduced that the scribbles at the top of the document was meant to be her name. "Does that symbol represent me?" she asked, pointing to her name. "Yes. Now, religious affiliation." Fara had been listening, and had figured out that that question had something to do with her faith. "My people believe in the spirits of our ancestors," she said. Heathens, the woman muttered aloud, but Fara did not understand what that word meant. And let me guess, your job description is basket weaving? The woman added sarcastically. Among other things, Fara said, but the woman simply wrote down her as unemployed. Fara studied her intently. The sight of the bored stranger fascinated her to no end. This person was from outside her world, someone who was truly striking out and exploring VenShara. Oh, how she envied her. Age? I was 10 rainy seasons old, but the last time we had a rainy season was... The woman studied her. Undernourished as Fara had been, she was not much taller than a healthy 10-year-old, though her body had clearly developed past that age. The last time it rained was 5 years ago. You are 15 years old, the woman informed. We've missed 5 rainy seasons? Fara said, shocked. How do you know? It's called a calendar, something you savages do not have, the woman huffed, then pointed to the document. Signature. Put your finger in the ink. No, Fara said. That's an order, the woman growled, but Fara shook her head and pointed to her name. This symbol is my name. Then it is my signature, not my fingerprint. Teach it to me, please. The woman was taken back by Fara's question. I haven't the time, the foreigner said, then looked to her general. He was also trying to get the tribe's people's information, but his short temper had made the going difficult. Right now he was in the middle of flipping his table, once again. She looked back at Fara. Poor savage, you never stood a chance. Fine, since it looks like I'll be stuck here anyway. The woman reached out and took Fara's hand, then placed the pen in it. Gently, she began to guide Fara's wrists into writing her own name on a blank piece of paper for the first time in her life. You are from beyond the big sand? Fara asked her as she tried to write her name alone. I am from Pia, as are you. I am not from Pia. Our home is... well, it's wherever the water is, Fara corrected. The woman was incensed. Pia is the name of our glorious empire. It stretches almost half of VenShara, and you and your mud huts are part of it. Although your people live on its fringes, it is no wonder you are unaware of your betters. Not to fear, we will dispatch a missionary for us here in time, if we remember you. Fara got the gist of what she was saying, though much of it was lost in translation. The details weren't important to her, though. What she did take from it was that the world was much, much bigger than her tiny little hut in her tiny little tribe. She was a part of an empire called Pia. She had a name that could be written, and strange people existed by their millions beyond the horizon. That knowledge filled her with wonder and a burning desire to know and learn about the world that had just gotten so much bigger. With a sudden understanding of how ignorant she actually was about the world, Fara found it difficult to find contentment in the idea of staying in her small tribe. A dream of adventure and learning filled her, finally answering the question of what she really wanted if all her basic needs were met. She wanted to explore, to strike out and taste what all the world had to offer. The very idea filled her heart with glee. She sighed, letting the dreams of adventure and discovery die just as they were being born. She had a child to raise, and there was no way she could do that traveling the world. Even if she didn't have VenShara to worry about, venturing out into the desert without a clear destination was suicide. No, she would live out her life here as a dutiful wife and mother, and she would be content with that. She finished writing her name, and the Pian woman looked at it, then raised a brow. Your handwriting is surprisingly good for someone who has never held a pen. You are a clever savage. What does that word mean, savage? Fara asked. It means uncivilized, the woman answered honestly, but Fara did not know what that word meant either. What is your signature? Fara asked, confusing the word signature for the word name. The Pian woman understood her meaning. My name is Saya, daughter of General Tobolt, Archmage of the Pian army. You would do well to remember that name. Now off with you. I've wasted enough time answering questions. Fara got up, putting her dreams of adventure away and focusing on the reality of her life. But as she began to walk away, the woman called after her suddenly. Wait. Fara turned, and the woman was studying her intently. It was you. Sorry. I sense magic in you, the woman said again. I sensed it once when we were approaching, and when you sat down, but I could not be sure until you started to walk away. It is dimming with your steps. So it is you. Stay here, I must inform the general. Saya walked over to the general, who was once again picking up his desk and demanding another ink pot. She spoke to him in her native dialect. Fara stood patiently, mulling the woman's words. She had magic, but what exactly was magic? Again, the word did not translate perfectly to Fara. To her, the woman had essentially said, "You have spirit." The general walked up to her and studied Fara for a moment, then shook his head. Too old. Old? She's barely a woman. Training to become a battle mage should start before they're even walking. Any later and such people become dangerous to handle. Besides, I doubt any of these savages have been properly indoctrinated, the man said dismissively, but then noticed VenShara sleeping soundly, strapped to Fara's back. The general had a gleam in his eye. The babe might be the right age, though. Did you test him? No, Saya admitted. Then do so. Perhaps this trip will produce fruit after all. Fara heard them mention her baby, but they were no longer speaking in her dialect, so she missed the insinuations. Had she understood them, she would have run, and perhaps they would have been too bothered to chase her. She doesn't understand, and doesn't run when Saya walked up to her and pulled out a small wand. Fara had never seen a wand, and did not understand why Saya put it in the hand of her sleeping baby. Her surprise was complete when the wand made of white marble lit up and sparked. Fara grabbed it from VenShara's hand, but in her own it sparked and flashed with even more intensity. Fara yelped and dropped it. The whole tribe turned wide-eyed and afraid, not understanding what was happening. Saya smiled. He has a lot of magical potential, just like his mother. What luck! The general grinned. He will make a fine addition to the Imperial Army. Take the boy. What? Fara asked. We should probably negotiate with the tribe leader first, Saya said to the general, ignoring Fara's question. There is nothing he can do to stop us. No, but if we turn this into a fight, we risk killing other magical bloodlines within this tribe. Bloodlines that could produce more battle mages in the future, not to mention the paperwork. The mention of paperwork was more than enough to convince him. In Fara's dialect, he ordered her, Find your leader. We wish to speak to him. Fara did not understand what was happening, but she grew uncomfortable with how the two looked at VenShara, like he was a chest of gold to be plundered, and was more than glad to leave them. She found her husband not too far off, and told him that they wanted to speak to him. He nodded and made his way to the peons. She should have ran, but how could she know the diabolical deal that was being struck? She was too far to hear them, and had no more reason to go closer to the strange outsiders. She watched from behind the door of the hut, and tried to decipher what was being said. Instinctively, she held VenShara even tighter. Her husband at first shook his head. The general frowned and shouted something. Saya came between them and pulled out a sword. At first, Fara thought they meant to kill him, but instead Saya handed him the blade. The sword glimmered not just with steel, but from the enchanted runes on its edge. A magic sword, and then Saya gestured to more weapons that were wheeled out in carts. Her husband looked hesitant. He glanced at Fara, or rather at Fara's child, then back to the two. Something again told Fara to run, but the idea of the chief selling her only son was an idea so absurd, her innocent mind did not even consider it a possibility. Saya then handed him a sack. He looked inside, then back up to the two and confused. The general face-palmed explained something to him, and Fara caught the word buy and gold. Her husband looked at the swords, then the sack of gold, then Fara. His brow furrowed. He considered his guests, and their army standing outside his vulnerable village. He made his choice. He summoned 2 of his warriors to his side, and told them something. They looked at him shocked. One even argues for a moment, but is cowed. Eventually they all follow him to Fara. Her husband's face was a contradiction. He looked sorrowful, almost pitiful. At the same time, though, Fara could tell he was trying to be firm. He walked up to her and said in a strong voice, "They tell me my son has powerful magic in his blood. They have agreed to train him in exchange for enchanted weapons for our warriors, and gold which we can use to buy water from the Pian garrisons stationed north of here. I have agreed to give them VenShara in exchange for these things." "What?" Fara almost fainted in disbelief. "He will have a good life," her husband continued. "He will receive a Pian name and become a fine warrior worthy of our tribe." Fara's world shattered. "You're selling him?" "It is what is best for our people," he said calmly. "No!" Fara screamed, holding VenShara tighter, and her panicked voice woke the baby and began to cry. "He is mine!" "This is not a request," her husband said sternly. "Do not make this difficult." "You have no right!" Fara shouted, but the chief only nodded to his 2 soldiers. They grabbed her, one by each arm, their faces forlorn but determined to follow their chief's orders. "No!" Fara screamed, then fought. She kicked at them and thrashed, a mother's love giving her strength that surprised even the 2 warriors, who genuinely had to struggle to keep her from bolting. Even so, she could not hope to overpower 2 of them, especially while trying to hold VenShara, who screamed in fright when one of the warriors grabbed him and began to pry him from her arms. Fara snarled like an animal, lunged her head forward, and bit him on the finger hard enough to draw blood. He yelped and relented, jumping back and freeing one of Fara's arms to strike the other man. Her wrist is caught by her husband, who shouts an order to the wounded warrior to take the child. He obeyed, pulling VenShara from Fara, who now had both arms restrained. She screamed like an animal, but now free of holding her baby could fight back with all her might. Years of work had made her limbs strong despite her petite frame, and she almost broke free twice in her struggle. The chief released his hold and took the now screaming VenShara from the other man, ordering him to help his fellow subdue his most favored wife. "Hold her till they are gone," he said, and began to walk towards them, still holding the screaming child. Fara fought valiantly. She bit and spat and pinched and punched, and used her body in any way she could to damage her assailants. The man to her right hooked his leg behind hers, throwing the fighting mother off balance, and together they took her to the ground, pinning her wrists to the floor. She struggled and cried and screamed in outrage, but she had been overwhelmed. "You can't do this!" she cried, tears bursting. "He's mine! He's my boy! The desert gave him to me!" The rest of her tribe people gathered to watch the spectacle. They stayed mostly silent, though it was clear that many were troubled by what they saw. There was little they could do, however, as her husband handed the screaming boy to Saya, who promptly handed him off to a slave. In return, a barrel of steel swords was wheeled out, and the gold was put into the chief's hand. "Pleasure doing business," the general said, and mounted his beast. Fara could only watch as the army began to walk away, as the cries of her baby grew more distant, with each step they took. "Please! Please, no!" she begged, but no one moved to assist her, nor did the 2 men release her until the chief bid them so. Fara's pleas became incoherent amidst her rising sobs and violent heaves, and in time the army from beyond the big sand disappeared below the horizon with her baby. Fara could only sob. She stopped struggling from sheer exhaustion alone. "Let her up." Her husband stood before her as the 2 warriors released their grasp on her. She lay there a moment, staring where her baby boy had been taken, the setting sun casting their direction in darkness. "I will give you another son. I will even let you name the next one, favored wife," her husband said, standing over her. His words struck her deeper than any sword could. Rage. She didn't know what made her more furious. The fact that her son had been sold for sharp and shiny rocks like an animal, or the idea that he could be merely replaced like an object, or the idea that the man who sold him would soon try to penetrate her body with his short little... She sprung at him with a savage snarl and would have killed him right then and there, but he was a trained fighter, and before she could wrap her tiny hands around his throat, he struck her in the face, hard. She fell back down to the ground, clutching the side of her face, gasping in pain, the fight knocked out of her. She lay there, curled up like a pill bug, her eyes shut tight, and whimpered, tears continually flowing. She wasn't aware that the crowd of people around her had slowly dispersed back to their work, that was now way behind schedule. All but one person. Miska gingerly went to Fara's side, and cupped her small body into her arms, cradling the weeping mother like a child. "I'm so sorry, Fara. I'm so sorry," is all Miska could think to say, and she carried her into her room. For the first time in Fara's life, she could not be content. Chapter 4. Sojourn. It was as if all the colors in her world had faded to gray. She rained tears that could have watered a small garden in their continual flowing. She did not eat or drink, nor lift her head from her arms. She just sat by her bed and sobbed into her pillow, and if the whole world was ending, she would not have been more distressed. At her side was her only friend. Miska stroked her hair and held her tight, trying hard not to cry herself, to be strong for Fara. They said little. There was nothing to say. No words could comfort a mother whose child was lost to her. Eventually, responsibilities to her own family pulled Miska away from her weeping sister. Fara spent the day drowning in her sorrow. That night brought little sleep, and the sleep that came was filled with nightmares, none of which compared to the nightmare she woke to. Her son was gone forever. Fara did not rise from her bed, didn't even lift her head to greet the dawn. She did not notice the days pass by her, and didn't care. That evening, Miska visited her with food and water, but Fara did not touch them. "You have to eat something," Miska said, lifting some dried meat to Fara's mouth, but Fara pulled away. Her tears had streaked the ritual makeup on her eyes, turning her face into the visage of misery. "What is the point?" Fara muttered bitterly. "At least drink something. You're weeping with no tears. Your body needs water." Miska reached for a bowl of water she had strained from the drying well, but Fara refused. "My world has been taken from me. What does it matter if I live or die?" Fara wailed and put her head back into her hands and wept. "No," Miska said lovingly but sternly. "You must live." "Why?" Fara demanded. Miska lifted Fara's downcast chin so her eyes met hers. "A wise woman once told me that this world does not give women like us the ability to choose. All we can do is try to be content with what we have." "I cannot be content with this," Fara hissed, sorrow flashing to anger. She pulled away from Miska and glared daggers at her. "What? Am I supposed to just carry on? Just be a dutiful wife? And what of my husband's duties? Is it not his job to protect me and my children?" Fara slapped a cup of water from Miska's hand, and in a rage so unlike her usual self. "Instead, he sold him! He sold my boy like he was cattle! He struck me. It's him I need defending from, and no one did anything. I wish the peons had attacked and killed you all. At least then I'd be left alone to weep for my child. Miska endured Fara's anger without judgment or retort. She looked disturbed to see her normally stoic friend in such throes of visible anger and despair, to see that the world had finally broken one so calm and immovable as Fara. Fara's outburst subsided, and she slumped back into the bed, dry heaving again. Miska took up the bowl of food and placed her arm around Fara. You must live, because your child is still out there. He's not dead, Fara. He's alive and misses his mother. If you die, he will leave him alone in this world. But if you live, there is a chance you may see him again. You will have a mother to return home to. Do not live for the tribe's sake or mine. Live for your son's sake. Miska paused, looking up and blinking away tears. And if you did die, I would have no one. You are my only friend. Fara looked up to her, her rage softening. Do you still hate me for stealing the affections of the man you love? Miska shook her head. I do not believe I still love him. Not after what he did to you. Miska looked down at Fara and gave her a gentle squeeze. Please eat something. To Miska's relief, her words seemed to have gotten through to Fara, for she did eat, though not much. She nibbled at the dried meat, and the two went quiet, drawing comfort from the warmth of each other's bodies. Fara looked into the eyes of her friend, remembering the time their lips met. She frowned at the feeling that welled up inside her. What was happening to her? Was she in love with Miska? Fara's life had never allowed such contemplation. The lives of her and her people were brutally simple, a constant race against starvation and extinction. Though Fara and Miska were adults in the eyes of their tribe, the reality was they were little more than children themselves. Fara was 15. Miska maybe 1 or 2 years older. Their world had forced them to grow up fast, gave them no quarter to wonder, experiment, or even figure out what love was. So when the terrors of their world found them together alone and afraid, they took comfort in the only place they could find it, each other. It didn't matter if it was true love or just girlish infatuation. They would take anything that gave them comfort, a scrap of affection, no matter how small or how seemingly perverse. Piousness, nobility, chastisement, none of that mattered to them when faced with the unrelenting cruelty of their lives. It was Fara who initiated the kiss this time, and this time they did not look away in shock or embarrassment. They did not understand why they felt this way, or what it meant, and didn't care. It felt good. It made them feel safe and loved. Like life was not merely toiling away to stay alive another day, or simply pleasing a husband who was never there and never returned genuine affection. Their lips parted and they put their foreheads together, and breathed in deeply, drawing strength from each other's shared despair. We will make it through this, Miska said tenderly. Fara nodded, and they lay together on her bed, wrapped in a gentle embrace, until both of them, without realizing it, fell asleep. When Fara woke up, Miska was gone. She lay in the bed, having been neatly tucked in by her friend. Her mind jumped to the night before, and she realized with alarm they had fallen asleep on the same bed. It was a good thing no one had walked in on them, or... Well, Fara wasn't sure what would have happened. This type of relationship she had with Miska, whatever it was, had never been mentioned to her by anyone. She rolled over, her mind going to thoughts of her son, and the grey pall of sorrow fell over her again. He was gone, taken from her by people she thought she trusted. Not love, maybe, but trusted. She pulled the covers over herself, and without Miska, began to sink back into her sorrow. She wanted Miska her friend, perhaps more than a friend, who somehow lifted her from her pits of despair. The beads to her room opened, and Fara turned around hopeful that it was Miska. Her disappointment was total, when instead she saw the first wife. The tall woman towered over her and looked down at Fara with a mix of disdain and pleasure. It's almost noon. How long are you planning to be a burden to us, The first wife sneered. Fara lay back down and turned her back to her. With a growl, she said, "Leave me be." The first wife grabbed the covers and ripped them off Fara. "It has been 3 days. You have duties to complete. Your people have no use for those who will not work. Go away." "You think you're the first woman to lose a child? Haleth lost her little one 2 weeks ago to fever, and on the second day she was back on her feet, and tears in her eyes, doing her duty. You shame yourself with your entitlement. I don't know why our husband favors you so." It was anger, not respect, that made Fara spring to her feet. "May the vulture shit out our husband!" The first wife gasped, putting a wrinkled hand to her chest in shock. "How dare you? After the favor he has shown you, you are not worthy of him." "He sold my son!" Fara snapped. "I do not desire any favor from him or you. Now leave me be!" "Insubordinate, disrespectful!" The first wife spat, appalled at Fara's bluntness and unapologetic disrespect. As the youngest wife and the newest, she should have shown the first wife the utmost respect. Fara had shown her respect, endured her commands and her lording herself over Fara for a year and more. But Fara was past caring now, past hiding her dislike, her outright hatred for the woman. Her open defiance threw the first wife into a rage of righteous indignation. The older wife slapped Fara in the face and smiled satisfied. She did not expect Fara to hit back. Fara didn't expect herself to hit back, and by the time she realized what she was doing, her fist connected with the first wife's face, splattering her nose against her cheeks. The old woman toppled over, and Fara took a step back, her eyes wide in panic. She had struck the first wife. Honored or not, that was a taboo she should not have crossed. The two stared at each other in shock at what just transpired. "Sorry," Fara stammered, but her words were cut short. The first wife leapt at her. "Witch!" The first wife was easily double Fara's height, and much heavier. She shoved Fara hard enough that she fell on the bed. Not missing a moment, the taller woman fell on her, her eyes wild with rage, her hand wrapped tight around Fara's slim neck, and she squeezed. "Steal my husband from me, will you?" she hissed. "Use magic in my village, will you?" Fara threw a punch at her attacker's face, but it did little. The first wife's long arms kept her out of reach of Fara's flailing limbs. "What are you doing?" Fara wanted to ask, but the pressure on her throat choked the words and breath out of her. The larger woman pushed Fara down into the bed, grinning with satisfaction. "You have fallen out of favor. No one will miss you. No one will blame you for ridding our people of you and your demonic magic. I will be the favored wife. His only wife!" Fara fought more desperately, realizing that she was about to be murdered. Her brain fought for oxygen. Her mind became a jumble of incoherent thoughts and emotions. The pounding of her limbs slowed and her vision dimmed. Miska's words came to her at that moment. "You must live, because your child is out there." Magic. It welled up inside Fara, and her mind became clear once again. The first wife's face turned from murderous glee to horror as a spider, hideous and black, bigger than a man's hand, crawled out of Fara's mouth and leapt onto her face. She shrieked as the fangs of the spider punctured her flesh. She slapped it away and fell back in horror as Fara rose from the bed, sand swirling about her. Spiders and centipedes and scorpions and all manner of creeping things seemed to form from the very sand around her, or fell from her hair and skittered towards the first wife. The first wife fled, tried to flee, but she had 10 biting, stinging creatures hanging to her clothes, and she only ran a couple of meters before dropping down into the sand, dead as stone, in front of the whole tribe. The magic left Fara's body, and she returned to her usual self, but stood stunned by what happened. Cries of terror swept through the people standing outside her home, and while Fara wasn't sure exactly what had happened, she knew enough that she had killed the first wife with her magic. Just then Miska ran into the room and cried out as the creeping things rushed her, seeing her as a threat to their master. "No, stop!" Fara called out, and the creatures froze in place. Miska looked between them and Fara wide-eyed. You did that? To the first wife?" Miska stammered. I didn't. It happened without me thinking. She was strangling me and... Fara couldn't finish the sentence. It sounded too absurd. Miska looked at the crowd gathering around the first wife, and the guards looking towards their room. "They're going to blame you," Miska said suddenly. She turned to Fara and ran to her, and gave her a forceful shove towards the open window. "Run, sister." "What?" "Run and find your son. I can stall them, but they'll blame you. People already suspect you have magic. Go and run. I will not let them kill you. Go!" "But what about you?" Fara asked desperately. Miska answered her question by pulling out a knife. Miska gave Fara a shove, sending her out the low-hanging window, just as the guards burst in. "Where is Fara?" One of them was already suspecting the window and moved towards it. Fara could not see what was happening, but she could hear Miska blocking the warrior's path, and she could hear the struggle ensue. Fara tried to summon her magic, but it would not rise to her mental commands. She felt it, available to her, but like trying to wiggle one's ears, the exact mental commands needed to access it were still unfamiliar to her. "Fara, run!" Miska cried to her, then shrieked, and Fara heard the slick sound of flesh being impaled. She did run, getting up from her prone position and sprinting towards the end of her village, tears rising as she went. It was tempered by determination. No, she would not stay here and be a passive servant, a leaf carried away by a stream. She would fight, for herself, for Miska, for her child. She ran, taking care to run behind the small mud dwellings that still had people in them, peering out of their windows at the commotion. Most of the tribe was at work, and the few that were at home were the elderly or the young. She managed to run all the way to the front of her village without being spotted and bolted for the desert beyond. An arrow cut a strand of her hair as it passed, sticking into the sand beside her. She spun to see 3 warriors hot on her heels, one notching another stone-tipped arrow. They shouted at her, "Demon! Witch! She's over here!" She skittered over the dunes, her sweat pouring out rare and precious water. She half ran, half rolled down one dune, and then back up another. Another arrow landed near her, closer now, and she turned back to see 2 of the warriors, spears raised, were closing in. Their legs were longer than hers, and they trained to hunt healthy, speedy prey. She could not outrun them. She spun as they closed in. Desperately she called out the innate powers that she now possessed. Magic, they called it, but she understood almost nothing of the powers she had just used. She tried every mental command and trick to summon the sands and the creeping things to her side, but nothing worked. The closest warrior threw his spear, and Fara ducked. It grazed her shoulder and pinned her wavy hair to the sand. Magic forgotten, she pulled it out and spun to the first warrior as he came in. He drew the silver sword, gifted to them by the peons, and the sight of it, the memory of the wrong that was done to her, banished the fear in her heart, and her magic rose once again. Sand twirled about her, obscuring her visage just as her attacker swung in. He stopped short, frightened by the sudden sandstorm that engulfed her, and was not quick enough to stop her thrust. Her spear sunk into his flesh, stabbing him in the waist, and he cried out, falling to the ground. His ally jumped over him and thrusted blindly into the raging sand that hid Fara. His spear never reached as a blast of sand met him. The grains pounded his chest with such force he was thrown backwards. The third warrior stopped short his fallen companion, bow raised. For a moment the sand around Fara subsided, and when the third man saw the woman, he dropped his bow from sheer terror. Fara was covered in the writhing bodies of the desert arthropods. They crawled out of her hair, out of her ears, slithered from her mouth, and combined with her tear-stained ritual markings, she really did look like the most frightful of witches. She extended her hand forward, and the creeping things leapt off her body as one and skittered towards the three. It was enough to break their morale, and they ran, carrying their wounded friend back to their village. But now other warriors were approaching from that direction, including her husband. He looked at her with a mix of fear and revulsion, then determination. He charged with all his warriors. Fara summoned the magic again, getting used to her strange powers. She caused the sand to swirl around her, obscuring her from view. Guided by instinct she did not understand, she blew, and her breath turned the swirling sands black and buzzing. Hundreds of thousands of grains of sand sprouted wings and legs and green eyes. The storm of sand became a swarm of flies, and they flew out, descending on the approaching warriors. The writhing swarm was enough to rout many of the warriors by itself. Using the panic as cover, Fara ran, disappearing into the desert. Only one warrior pushed through the swarm of flies. He stood, watching her disappear behind another wall of sand. Her husband started after her. Chapter 5. Till Death Do Us Part. Miska was dead. The thought of it left a pit in Fara's belly. She stopped walking and fell to her hands and knees, trying to keep from crying, to fight back the tears and keep what little water she had in her from spilling out. She never got the chance to sort through her feelings for the third wife, to figure out what she really felt romantically. She never got the chance to even consider romance. That too had been ripped from her, the world once again giving her no time, no opportunity to figure out what she truly was. Miska was dead. It didn't matter anymore whether it was true love or merely an abusive relationship that drew them together, forced them together. I have no one, and nothing, Fara muttered, almost giving in to despair. Maybe it would have been better to just let them kill her. But Miska's words returned to her mind. You must live, because your child is out there. He's not dead, Fara, he's alive, and he misses his mother. If you die, you will leave him alone in this world. Fara gritted her teeth, and thanked the spirit of Miska for reminding her of her purpose. Her fists clenched, and she rose to cling on to that faint and oh so distant hope. She would find her son, or she would die in the attempt. She walked for many hours as the harsh sun beat down on her, taxing the resistance of her ebony skin. As luck would have it, the tracks of the army that had took VenShara could still just barely be seen, giving her a general direction of where to go. Following them took her across the endless dunes, and in time she saw landmarks that made her jaw fall open. Many miles from her village, the mummified remains of finned beasts lay bleaching under the sun. Their teeth were almost as long as their bodies. Their mouths were eternally open. The unfamiliar aquaticness wasn't the strangest thing about these beasts, though to Fara, knowledge of any ocean-dwelling creature was totally absent. No, what made these dried corpses iconic was their sheer sizes. Some blocked a good part of the horizon, their mouths alone easily large enough to comfortably house a large town. Beached hides stood up high in the sky. Having sat there for so long, massive sand dunes had formed over half of it. The desert before her was littered with the long dried-up corpses of hundreds of massive ocean-dwelling beasts. The smallest were the size of a man, the largest rivaled mountain ranges. What were these creatures? How long had they been sitting here in the desert? Where did they come from? She studied them, realizing that their remains were far, far older than the oldest mummies her tribe had ever created. A more pressing question crossed her mind. Where could she find water? She had brought no supplies and could feel her blood getting thicker. She would die out here, and soon. The dried bodies of the massive alien creatures were still some distance away. Before them was a series of rocky outcrops that created a small maze leading to them. As Fara drew closer, she realized that the rocks weren't rock at all, but bone, bleached by the sun and whittled away by eons of erosion. The great barrier of bone had stained the surrounding desert white with little grains of sand, but one could still see the subtle forms of shelled creatures that made up the bony mass. She entered the maze of bone, using the dorsal fin of the mountainside mummified fish as a waypoint. She walked slowly, studying the remains of water-dwelling creatures her people had long ago lost the names for. She makes it halfway through the maze before stopping, panting hard and flopping under what little shade the rocks could provide her. She had stopped sweating, and she knew what that meant. Her death was upon her. Would her bones now join the bones of these unfortunate creatures? She closed her eyes and focused, trying to rouse the one thing that might save her. The spirits of the desert, my ancestors, Miska, help me now. She felt out the connection to the desert, and now, deep in her element, her powers awakened with renewed vigor. The mental commands needed to access her magic had become easier, and out of the sands all the hidden creatures rose, crawled, or skittered towards her. A snake slithered into her lap, and she opened her eyes, focusing on it. "I need water," she said with parched lips. "Where do the desert creatures get theirs?" Fara always understood the minds of creeping things, but now that understanding went to a new level. For in that instant she peered into the memories of the serpent, saw its life from its perspective, its simple wants and fears. It wanted safety, food, feared hawks and larger reptiles, and it drank from a hidden pool in this maze. It was as if her mind and the serpent's mind had merged, and she flicked out her tongue without realizing it. How deep did her powers go? Hurriedly she made her way to the pool, remembering where it was as if she had traveled there 100 times. It was a small pool, hidden deep in the maze. Even if a traveler had chanced upon it, they may have missed it entirely, for it was well hidden beneath the bleached, mummified body of a large eel bigger than Fara. She crawled into its mouth and into its rock-hard stomach to find the hidden pool of water that lay sheltered from the heat of the sun by its bleached hide. She drank the surprisingly refreshing water that seemed to fill up slowly from some unseen underground stream. Then she slept, exhausted. She woke up several hours later, feeling refreshed. She silently gave thanks to the spirits, then crawled out of the mummified creature. As she stood and stared into its empty eye sockets, she decided to thank its spirit as well. She sat down and focused again, the mental commands needed to access her magic becoming easier every time she did it. This time a lizard approached her, and she asked it politely, "Do you know a way out of this maze?" Of course, it could not answer, but Fara still felt rude to pry into its mind without any manners. She gently prodded its memory to find the answer, feeling the world as it did. She felt its calm at her side. Then, a sudden fear. Her eyes opened as she felt, as it did, that a predator was approaching. She sprung to her feet at the same time it fled and spun to face her husband. He was alone, staring at her with murderous intent, his spear raised. "How long were you a witch?" Fara pointed her own spear at him and glowered. "From before our joining," she was unapologetic in her response. "You lied about who you were." Her husband sounded pained. "You never cared who I was! You never knew me, never wanted to know me. I was just your concubine, your whore." Fara's dagger-like eyes pierced him with their intensity and rage. He took a step back in fear, but then steeled himself. "You were my wife. I did love you." "You did not! You loved the passive facade I put up to appease you. You hadn't the slightest clue how I felt. I hated you. From the very time we were joined, you annoyed me, and my dislike for you grew with every night you used me to satisfy yourself. She looked down, clenching her fists. Her shoulders drooped. And you know what? I was okay with that. I get it. We don't have time for things like love, true love. We're too busy trying not to die for that. I was fine with my role, would have endured you happily, bearing your children, being your favorite wife for all my life. It's not ideal, but it was my role as a woman, just like it's your role to risk life and limb to protect the tribe. The world demands that we fulfill our roles without complaint, and I was okay with that. She looked up at him, the sand beginning to circle, her face twisting in hatred. But then you sold him! You sold my son! I did it for the good of the tribe, her husband shouted, stepping back as her magic caused the sand in the whole area to whip up in a frenzy. The Peons would have taken VenShara anyway, and we needed the gold to buy water for our people. Would you have our tribe burn just for your son? I would have the whole world burn for the sake of my son, she screamed, and the sand rushed towards him, shaping itself into deadly needles. He leapt to the side, and the sand needles embedded themselves into the white wall behind him. You are not the first witch I have slain, he roared defiantly, and pulled out the enchanted sword given to him by the Peons. Another blast of sand came for him, but he was nimble, rolling aside and pointing the enchanted blade at her. A blast of light launched itself, colliding with her sand veil. The explosion of magic threw her back. She landed on her back a few meters away, rolled and got to her feet, then twisted her body sideways as his spear flew past her, tearing the thin desert garment above her chest. He charged in with a battle cry, and Fara knew she was in trouble. She had time for maybe one more cast before he was in melee range, and then she would surely lose. This time she focused her mind on her friend the wind, that so often caressed her during her nightly ritual. Arcane intuition she did not understand guided her action. She twirled her spear, now turned a makeshift staff, and just as he was about to plunge his blade into her heart, she swung the spear in an upward arc. Wind and sand swirled past her in a gust so powerful it sent her up, and him flying back. He crashed into the wall of bone with a crack the wind blasted from his lungs. Fara floated only for a few moments, the wind carrying her away a couple meters, giving herself time to cast again. She called upon the desert creatures, focusing on summoning the very venomous ones, but then she staggered, resting on her spear for support. She shook her head, feeling suddenly weak, and the sand around her lessened in intensity. What was happening to her? She felt tired? But not in the physical sense. It was as if her connection to the desert was being strained, like she was working out some metaphorical muscle too much and needed to rest it. Her husband got to his feet and pulled out a boomerang. Fara could feel magic coming from it, another enchanted weapon, but one from her own people. He threw it at her, and she rolled to the side as it spun past, but then it turned to follow her. The enchanted boomerang smacked her in the leg with more force than should have been physically possible. She felt one knee wincing. The boomerang fell to the ground, then rose as if by magic, and flew back to her husband's hand. He was charging again, whipping the boomerang back at her. This time she was ready, and knocked it to the side with a stream of sand, then threw her arms out towards him, pushing her arcane muscle to flex its power beyond its limits. He was upon her, swinging his sword down at her, when a venomous snake leapt from the sand at her feet. He switched targets with his swing, slashing the snake's head off instead of Fara's. Fara could feel her magic giving out, her power used up. But she still had the hunting spear in her hand, and now he was open. She plunged it into his belly and pushed. He gasped, falling back as she drove it deeper into his body, his lifeblood flowing. Her tears flowed with it, and when she looked into his horrified eyes, she suddenly stopped and let go of the weapon. He slumped to the ground, holding the spear now buried into his gut, and wheezed. Fara glared at him, trying to sustain the fires of her hatred. but as she gazed upon her dying husband, her expression of rage could not hold. It cracked despite her efforts, and melted into a look of shock and panic. No, 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 no. She fell to her knees in front of him, reaching for the spear with trembling fingers, but knowing logically pulling it out would only hasten his death. I am sorry. Her panic rose, as did her sorrow and her tears. She felt a hand brush against her cheek and wipe her tears. She looked up into his face. He was smiling at her. You weep for me. Your hatred for me cannot be so great, he said softly. I weep for the love that was never between us, but could have been, and now will never come to pass. She took his hand in hers. Forgive me, Fara. I am to blame. I did love you. Even now I cannot bring myself to strike you down. She heard something fall beside her, and only just noticed he had dropped his blade in his right hand. He looked into her eyes. I didn't know how to show you my love. I still don't. For that I am sorry. Forgive me as I pass into the realm of our ancestors. Fara nodded, then kissed him gently on the lips. A genuine kiss, not one forced out of duty. For the first time the couple had an understanding. The world had never taught them how to love, how to communicate as husband and wife. They were too busy trying not to die to learn that. Fara looked at her husband as if she saw the man for the first time. Not a mindless brute, just a man as scared and as unsure as she was. A man who had been given a twisted idea of love by a world that forced brutal practicality over mutual understanding, over true love. Now he lay dying, and Fara sat by him paralyzed by the horror of it all. Now, when they were finally speaking, communicating, getting to know one another in the truest sense, now just starting to forge something stronger than the purely transactional relationship their marriage had been. Now, when genuine love might grow between them, he was dying. She wept. They wept together at the realization of the chance realized too late. She felt his hand on her shoulder as the last of his lifeblood ebbed away. He squeezed. I am sorry about Kishara. I was afraid of the Peons, and for our people. But with your power, you can amend my actions. Go, Fara. Find our son and bring him home. Talon, she began. But he was gone, the last of his strength leaving him. She kissed him again, and rose, the last ties to her home cleanly severed. She wiped her eyes and steeled herself. This cruel world continued to take from her. She could not get back Miska or Talon, but Kishara was still out there, and she would not let the world have him. She would find her son, or burn the world in the attempt. She turned towards the horizon, towards Pia and all VenShara had waiting for her, and took a defiant step forward. This has been Sands of VenShara, Book 1. This is not the end of Fara's story. There's a lot more to tell. I have like a whole series planned out. If you want to hear more, subscribe if you're on YouTube, and if you're not, do whatever, likes or whatever site this is on. And I'll make more. Probably make more if it does well or not, because I just like making these. So let me know what you thought of the story in the comments. And take care.